So you could have a D-Star radio and a DMR radio running together, and you'd be able to switch between them. So I've talked about a little bit of this already. It's basically a simplex repeater, although there are duplex boards available, and we'll talk about that more in the second session. You can connect with multiple networks. The biggest thing is, for me anyway, is it gives you full control over your device. So if you're using someone else's repeater, for example, you are required to use it the way they've set it up. And normally that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I'm going to go over some of the reasons this works out well for you in a minute here. Okay, so reasons you might want one. For myself, I live in Orange County, California, and I can get it into DMR repeaters. That's kind of my favorite mode. But I can get into DMR repeaters on probably 4 or 5 different hilltops with a handheld from inside my little home office here. So that's not a big deal for me. But for a lot of people on the Monday Night Net, for example, they just plain don't have any DMR repeaters. There aren't any there. So this gives them access to the networks, even if they don't have a local repeater. Local repeater may not have the talk groups you want to use. There are nets, for example, that I like to listen to, but I don't want to tie up a repeater with a net that only I'm listening to. So a lot of times I'll monitor those through my hotspot because it just seems like a better use of resources to me. They're also great for travel. If I take a long road trip, I will connect my hotspot up to the Wi-Fi on my telephone and go on my drive. And now I can drive 300 miles and never have to worry about changing the frequency on my radio. It lets me stay connected to people back home for as long as I have, cell coverage at least. And everything is good. Excuse me. Same if you're traveling in an area that doesn't have DMR repeaters, you can connect up and be able to get on the air. And then the final thing is cross-mode operation. And I'll talk about that in more detail, but the basics are in a few of the modes, like if you have a Yaesu radio, you could key up on DMR, P25, or NXDN and talk to those networks. And I'll go over that more in a little while. All right, so the hotspot itself, there's this hardware component to it. Basically 2 parts. There's an RF deck that handles the radio side of business, and there's the computer, which in the picture here is just a Raspberry Pi Zero W, and that handles all of the computing side of things. The RF board has the transmitter, the receiver, it does the RF filtering, it has the analog to digital and digital to analog converters. It also does protocol detection. And it's kind of hard to see in this diagram, but off towards the right on this board, there's a series of LEDs there that tell you what mode it's operating on. And the firmware that's on this board will detect that off air and hand off the packets to the computer component so it can be sent out appropriately over the network. The RF board is also where you would typically connect a display if you're going to have a display on your device. The Raspberry Pi Zero, like I said, is a general computing device. It handles the network traffic. It provides a hosting for the configuration page and the dashboard. And with its low cost, it allows you to build these things at a very reasonable price. All right, any questions about where I've gone so far?
There are no questions in the chat yet. So
Okay,
as you guys, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to throw those in the chat box. To get to it, you hover over your screen. It'll be at the bottom of the window.
all right. So I'm going to start diving into the PyStar side of this. So when I first got started with hotspots and MMDVM stuff, this was really complicated because nobody had uh, kind of performed the role of a system integrator. So you'd go to GitHub and you'd get software from one guy to do this, and you'd get software from somebody else to do that. You had to configure them up to work together. And it was a challenge to make it all come together and work. Um, I worked with other people on the Papa system, and we configured up several repeaters that are based on MMDVM software, and had a lot of fun doing it. But it was a bear to get it configured. And then Andy in the UK came along and created PyStar, and this really performed the role of integrating everything together. He made a single image people could download that had all of the various software pieces, parts pre-configured, and he created a simple web-based dashboard and configuration screen to pull it all together. So this is the basic dashboard, and I'm going to break it down into some components here, but it shows uh, who's been talking, how long they've talked, various status information, things like that. So the mode section. So the grayed out modes have been turned off, and I do that on mine because if I have, say, D star connected to a fairly active reflector, then my hotspot will be transmitting every time that reflector goes active, and I won't hear the DMR traffic that I'm looking for. If you're connected to less busy things, it's okay to have multiple modes enabled at a time. So you just got to kind of experiment with that on your own and see what's going to work for you. And then the network status, typically both the network status and the mode will be green. If there's a network issue of some kind, it will change to red. And basically your hotspot is disabled at that point. If you have a repeater or a duplex hotspot, it will retransmit locally. It'll just operate in standalone mode. But not very many people really need a duplex hotspot. Radio info. The screenshots I took here are off of a duplex hotspot. And so you see the separate transmit and receive frequencies, firmware, which crystal is on it, and if it's listening, transmitting, or in standby mode, it'll indicate that on here. And then this section, you'll have a little panel like this for each mode you have enabled, and I just put two of them up here as an example. So DMR has certain settings that are unique to it, and those settings are displayed here. P25 has a different set of settings that are unique, as do YSF and D-Star and the others. So depending on what modes you have enabled, you'll see different things there. And these show up back here down at the bottom of this left panel, and that'll just keep going down for whatever modes you have enabled. Okay, so the gateway activity, this is kind of a good panel here. It really tells you what's going on. I typically have this available when I'm doing a net. I also have the last heard from Brandmeister visible during the net, and it just gives me two different views of what's going on. For the most part, this info is all pretty self-explanatory. duration is just how long the QSO was. Loss and BER do need a little bit of explanation. So loss is packet loss on the network, and this would come from sometimes if people are running a hotspot on their cell phone, it may not get all the packets through, so you'll start seeing packet loss here, or other various network issues. Like I've got one friend that, he may end up with 3 people streaming Netflix when he's trying to be on a net or something, and his hotspot just kind of doesn't get enough traffic as a result. And then BER is on the airborne part of the signal, and this is specifically from the transmitting radio to whatever it gets into, whether it's a hotspot or a repeater. And this refers to just plain either interference or weak signal or any number of things that would make some of the packets not decodable. Now, you can get a pretty high bit error rate and still get through fine if you're using something like DMR. If you're using something like D-Star, you're going to start having the voice, and by pretty high, I mean 12 or 13%. D-Star, if you get over 2 or 3%, you're going to start hearing artifacts on the audio. And other modes have different thresholds. So you can just kind of take a look at that. But that'll tell you if it's a network problem or an RF problem. So it's something useful to look at. Okay, now the basic dashboard I showed you before has a more detailed version. It's called the admin screen. And you do have to log in to see this one because it does give you the ability to make some changes. There's a section at the top added on here that gives you more detail about the device that's running, CPU load, CPU temperature, and it has information about the operational status of a lot of the internal processes. Now, for what I was doing on this particular hotspot, most of the services are disabled, so that's why you see them red here, but that's not a problem because I'm not using them. And you'll just kind of get used to what that looks like on your particular hotspot. Okay, so let me do a quick demo here. So the basic dashboard looks like this. And this is what I had showed you guys before. This is the hotspot I have running for DMR only. And it will just sit here like this. If I just turn my radio off because somebody was talking on it. So I apologize, I should have had this ready. Okay, so what you see here is I was able to key this up, and you see my call sign at the top of the list here. You see my bit error rate was high. I'm not really sure why that is. And down at the bottom, it shows local RF. This means stuff that's keyed it up. And for a hotspot, that's not really a very important thing, but there is a variation of a hotspot board that allows you to either hook up a pair of radios or to a repeater to actually make a multi-mode repeater. And having that separation is good on a repeater because it lets you see a quick summary of everybody that's keying it up and what's going on with their signals. So it is kind of a nice thing. And then when I switch over to admin here, I already put my credentials in, so it's not going to ask for it. But you can see how it adds this additional section at the top that gives me a little more info. And then for DMR, it adds some extra information up here as well. So that I could add a static talk group or delete a static talk group. There's some hoops, a couple of hoops you have to jump through to get this turned on, but it's not a big deal. And if we do an advanced class, I'll go over how to do that. But so it just gives you a little more information here, and I'll let you do some experimenting. So I think that's all I wanted to do for the demo at this point. Okay. Any questions at this point, Jamie?
There are still no questions in the chat box.
Okay, well, we may get through this a little quicker than I had anticipated.
Maybe there might be some questions towards the end too.
Yeah.
We'll be happy to field those.
What I find is when I do this in person, people are very willing to interrupt me, but when I do it online, I don't get that so much. So I tend to get through it a little quicker when I'm doing it online.
Yeah, understood. And by the way, your radio's trying to roam in the background.
Oh, isn't that nice of it? We'll just turn that off, and then we won't have to worry about it. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the configuration pages real quick, and I don't want you guys to take this as, you know, follow this to set up the hotspot, but I want you to see that it's just not that hard. And I feel like a lot of people have convinced themselves that hotspots are difficult to configure, and they just aren't. You know, just look at the screens and fill it out. So this page, this is kind of the first chunk of data you have to fill out on the configuration page. The host name is what it's called on the network, and you could leave it just its default, which is pi-star, pi-star. I changed mine because I have multiple hotspots running, so I want them to have different names. And you can decide if that's something important to you or not. The node call sign is your own call sign. You only need a DMR ID on here if you're doing DMR. If you're set up for a simplex frequency, it's just going to ask for one. Or if you're set up for a simplex hotspot, it's only going to ask for one frequency. You can put your lat lon in here if you want or not. Location information, this defaults to the QRZ profile for your call sign. The radio modem type, we'll talk about that more in the second session, where it's going to vary a little bit depending on which specific board you selected. Node type is something where you might actually have a question about it. Basically, if it's set to private, MMDVM will only retransmit traffic that's for your call sign. If you want to be able to use, you know, have a friend be able to use it when they're visiting or something like that, you need to set it to public. APRS host, just set that appropriate for you. Time zone and English. I mean, these are all questions that really anybody should be able to answer without too much difficulty. Okay, and then after you save that, you get the option to select the modes you want to have active. You can have multiple modes active, and it will scan between them looking for a key up, and then it'll lock onto that mode. I've chosen not to do that just because I did. I don't know why. But so I just have DMR enabled. These settings a little further down. Is there like a, yeah, there's a pointer. The settings down, oops. Okay, this thing's getting away from me. These settings down here are for crossband operation. And then I'm not really talking about the POXAG, but that's a paging protocol that is available through here as well. And then the final setting here is for the display type, and we'll talk about that in the hardware setup talk. So then if you're going with DMR, this is the DMR configuration area. You set your DMR master. There's basically one master per country, except for the US where there are 3. The West Coast master is 3103. I have my hotspot set to 3102 because when I'm doing the net, I want to be able to monitor myself through a different path than the repeater I'm using. So if I have a connectivity issue on my local repeater, I can still hear it on my monitor radio, or if people are doubling, sometimes I'll get them on one radio but not the other, things like that. So it's a monitoring path for me. And other than that, it's pretty much just basic setup stuff. See what's that? Oh, there's this other settings area here. I very seldom change anything on the firewall. And then the bottom section here is just for setting up your Wi-Fi. And I have, I don't know, probably 4 different Wi-Fis configured here. It will auto scan and connect to whatever's appropriate. And it really works quite well. So, yeah. So that's it for that settings area. Okay, cross mode operation. I told you I'd talk about that. So you need to get 2 concepts in mind here. The first one is what kind of radio you're using to talk to your hotspot and what mode you want to go out on. And the hotspots support what's on this grid. So if you have a YSF radio, which would be like a Yaesu FT3 or an FT70 or a FTM, what is it, 7250 or an FTM 400, then you can go to DMR, P25, or NXDN. I will throw one little tidbit out there. If you're going to go to P25, you need to set the fusion radio to wide mode as opposed to narrow. That's just to get enough data there for P25. And then if you've got a DMR radio, you can go to YSDF or YSF or NXDN. And those are the only cross-mode operations that are available. To set that up, again, up here on this mode selection thing, you pick the mode that your radio has available, and then the mode you want to go to, in this case, DMR. And now in the System Fusion configuration area, you select this. Normally, you would select a YSF room that you want to go to. In this case, there's like a built-in one that's for going YSF to DMR. So you select that. The master and the talk group you want to use. Other than that, it's all set up for you. And that's it. And now you can keep your YSF radio and come out on DMR. So it's pretty easy and straightforward to do. I was just going to walk you through the configuration screen here. I guess I should put notes up there to remind me what I wanted to show people.
Hey, Michael, we do have a question.
And go ahead.
I might have missed this a little bit. So the question is, why do multiple devices, Anytone 578 or Anytone 878, share the same ID?
Okay. So, DMR is basically, I mean, not basically, for all intents and purposes, it is an IP network over the air. And the radio ID is used to build the IP address for the radio. If you have 2 radios on at the same time using the same ID, there is a possibility that the system could get confused. But the only thing that would confuse it is if one radio had keyed up on, say, repeater A, and the other radio had keyed up on repeater B, and someone tried to send a text message or a direct call to that ID, it would only send it to the radio that had keyed up most recently, because it knows which repeater to deliver that message to. If it's important to you to be able to differentiate those, you can request an additional ID, and it will separate those. What else? Oh, the other reason you might want to do it is for APRS. Say you have a mobile radio in your car and handheld, you might want to have those report location services differently to the APRS network.
So I think I want to jump in too to help
Yeah, go
answer
ahead.
this question a little bit, just because the question is kind of interesting. So radioid.net has started to only issue single IDs, and it's like pulling teeth to get them to issue more than one. And that's mostly related to the explosion or popularity of DMR in the amateur realm. Amateur radio, or DMR, was developed for the intent of commercial use. So in the DMR standard, there's 16,776,416 DMR IDs, and there's a few that are reserved for specific functions. Don't ask me how I know that number by heart, but um, what that when the radio ID group, so the group before them that were issuing IDs to people had those, they had this intent to have a numbering uh, standard that they would use. So you'll notice most of us in the US will have an ID that starts with a 3, a 1, and then a digit. And then all the talk groups that are US, we'll call it coming out of the US, have that same standard. They start with threes. All the repeater IDs start with threes. Well, here in the US, we've started to eat up all of our allocation. And so the radioid.net team is trying to figure out how to do that or reassign those numbers. So right now, the idea is that typically one ham can only operate one radio at one time under one call sign, which is not necessarily true, right? Some of us can be a control operator for radios that we can see in front of us. So like if we're doing a jamboree on the air or something like that, we could technically be a control operator for more than one. And that would be where you might want to have more than one radio ID as an example. But typically, for most hams, you're running one radio at one time in one place, even if you travel. So that's typically why there's only one ID issued. Again, just like Michael mentioned, it is possible to request another one. You'll probably have to justify your request a little bit with the radioid.net team. But as an example, I have 3 because I have a mobile, portable, and then different brands of radios, and they report their location services differently. So that's why that's sort of important. So anyway, it's not that I have to have 3. 3 makes it super easy for me to um, run a service like I do the Chili Hilly support up here, a bicycle race, and I may walk away from my vehicle and they want to know where I am versus maybe where my vehicle is. So those are examples of, to Michael's point, of having multiple IDs, so for location purposes as an example. But all right, I think hopefully that answers the question. And then Robin is asking, but you could monitor both radios simultaneously and only key up on one at a time. That is true. You can. You can key up one radio, or you can have both radios on listening to different things. That's true, through a single repeater. So if you have traffic on one time slot and traffic on another time slot, you could have each radio listening to each of the time slots, basically, and you could be listening. But they can have the same ID. That won't actually impact how that works, if that helps. And over to you, Michael, for any add-on to that and to carry on, unless I see something else come up.
Okay. Yeah, so this is the configuration screen. This is the MMDVM host section I was talking about. As you scroll on down, there's the general configuration, DMR. The hotspots do have the ability, oh, that looks bad, for you to connect GPS to them. I would consider doing this if I was using my hotspot mobile, for example. Or if you've got a repeater up on a hill, you might hook it up to a GPS to get the time accurate on the repeater, not so much for location information. And then this is the wireless that I showed you before. So the only thing you'll really see change on this is like this area. Am I still sharing my screen?
You are, yes.
Okay. It's not showing me the highlighter thing over here anymore. Um, as you turn on more modes, you'll have different mode specific sections that you'll need to set up. But that's about the only change you'll really see here. Other things that are interesting up here, there is an expert mode that gives you access to settings for individual lower level components. Generally, you don't go in here very much, except like at setup time. You might need to do a couple things. This power menu allows you to reboot your device or to do a traditional shutdown on it. Update will cause an update cycle to run, which normally happens every night. But if you don't leave your hotspot on 24/7, you can come in here and run an update whenever you want. Backup and restore is great. It creates a little zip file that has all of your settings in it and allows you to download it and store it on your computer. And if you need to restore your hotspot or build a new one, you can just restore those settings and tweak them, and you're off and running. Highly recommended that you do this. And then factory reset sets everything back to the factory settings, and you get to start over. That's all I wanted to talk about there. Okay, I already talked about this. Yes, get digital, my friends. Have fun on the air. And that's about it for the presentation. I wanted to share this picture though. This was an early multi-mode repeater we set up. Over here on the right, this is an MMDVM board that allows us to use the RF deck that's in this repeater. So we had a nice Hilltop full repeater running the same Pi-Star software that we're talking about today. And so this is an older Raspberry Pi. So we have this Wi-Fi module on it. This is just a battery pack. This is a cellular hotspot, and this is the duplexer for the repeater. So we've had a number of these running for quite a while, and they work great. I've seen other people set these up with a pair of mobile radios and be able to get something up on the air, and it works out really well.
So at this time too, I've
Yeah.
enabled everybody to ask questions, so you guys can unmute. But I'm going to stop recording since the presentation is over. Basically, even though the questions might be important, I'll try to capture those and then write them down for the question and the answer, and then I'll post that to the Puget Sound DMR Coalition's website for review. Right. But thank you, Michael, so much for that, and start recording.
And I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so that we can go back to just kind of a normal